Hello, and welcome to the Mathematician's Podcast, the podcast where we follow the fascinating stories behind the people that count in the history of mathematics. I'm your host, Benjamin Cornish, and today we are looking at Isidorus of Miletus. He was a mathematician and architect, vaulting the gap between two great pillars of intellect, Alexandria and Constantinople. He wrote little of his own work, but his efforts in preserving mathematics are evident in both stone and parchment. There will, sadly, not be all that much maths that I can get to talk about today, but I do have two very curious stories to tell. But first, I used to have a friend who was a miner. He would spend all day long digging down the mines for precious gems, ingots of gold, iron ore, and the occasional fossil. Unfortunately for him, one of our other friends is a geologist and cast an element of scepticism over his mining prospects with all these minerals being found in the same vein of rock. As it transpires, what my friend actually did all day was play an immersive multiplayer online role-playing game. So, we joined in the game one day. My avatar, mathematicians_pod, a level 1 sage, followed him into the mining area of the game. I watched him dig for a few hours, whilst I pretended to fight cave spiders for 1 gold coin per spider. Honestly, the only thing more tedious than grinding against a level 1 cave spider for 4 hours would be mining for 4 hours. The strangest bit was after he left the mine. He took his deposits of various ore, gems and fossils and walked for miles into the depths of the woods. Luckily for me, I had purchased a cloaking potion from a merchant so I could follow him into the wood without being discovered. There he deposited the ores carefully into what was unmistakably an intentional pattern. Then he logged out. Later that night at the pub, we all sat around the table discussing our day's labour. I regaled them with another excellent story of my exploits as an ice cream man, and my miner friend still maintained the pretence that he had spent the day mining. He had even covered his hands in dust to make it look more convincing after our scepticism the night before. Curiously, given that we know he had not been to an actual paying job, he still paid for our drinks for what must have been the 300th night in a row. More curiously, he always pays using cryptocurrency. I decided to follow him into the game once more, and this time I waited in that distant forest for many hours after he left. I was set upon by a tree goblin, but by now my creature-fighting skills were sufficiently high that I survived the brawl. But then, a short while later, a new player came through the trees, looked at the arrangement of ores, took a screenshot, then collected them and left. I made a note of their name, normal_citizen_34, which struck me as odd, because a normal citizen does not usually refer to themselves as normal citizen, and I speak as someone with experience because I am definitely not a pirate. So I started doing some digging and found Normal Citizen 34 on LinkedIn, which seems like a crucial mistake on their part that they chose to use their real name in the game, and had listed as their most recent LinkedIn job title as Foreign Espionage. I won't tell you which country they worked for, as I am still hoping to be sponsored by the Norwegian government. But still, my friend was a spy, passing secrets to a foreign government, all under the disguise of something boring and tedious. Goes to show, doesn't it? Interesting things often hide in boring places. Last week, we talked about Anthemius of Tralles, and I mentioned he had a partner in Shrine, or at least a partner to his architectural work. So, to bridge the gap between Anthemius and Isidorus, let's talk about their most significant project, the Hagia Sophia. As anyone who has played Civilization V as much as me can tell you, Hagia Sophia is one of the 8 wonders of the world, constructible during the medieval era, and I am told that Isidorus based his designs off this very video game. I shall now quote from the game by quoting from Procopius, "For it soars to a height to match the sky, and as if surging up from among the other buildings, it stands on high and looks down upon the remainder of the city, adorning it, because it is part of it, but glorying in its own beauty." It was a Christian church, then an Orthodox Christian church, briefly a Catholic church during an embarrassing Fourth Crusade, then an Orthodox church, then a mosque, then a museum, and then in 2020 a mosque again. Which goes to show that they are all probably just worshipping the same god, but wearing different hats. And if you want a more sensitive discourse on religion, you can look into a different podcast, because we're here to talk about architecture. Originally, the church was built out of wood. Personally, I think anyone who builds a building full of candles out of wood is pretty fearless. But then, sport happened. Back in Rome, there were these chariot races that were a hotly contested affair, much like the Arsenal-Tottenham Hotspurs conflict, which my Year 10s reliably inform me is a football arrangement. For international listeners, Year 10 refers to 14 or 15-year-old school students. But in Rome, the racing factions were the blues and the greens. In ancient days, in Rome proper, that is, Rome in Rome, there were also the whites and reds. But in the Eastern Roman Empire, so that's Rome Constantinople edition, it was just the blues and greens. Emperor Justinian was initially a blue supporter, but he chose to take a more neutral stance to avoid accusations of favouritism later in his reign. In 532 CE, there was a factional riot called the Nika riot, where 30,000 supporters died and about half the city burnt down. I would love to describe this as a green versus blue affair, but the story becomes less whimsical. It appears that Justinian was losing a war against the Persians and raising taxes. Combined with paying less attention to the factions, the two factions united and rose up against Justinian. The trigger for this was a smaller riot earlier on, where some supporters were due to be executed, but the scaffolding broke and they were saved from execution, then held in a nearby church whilst the scaffolding was repaired. Both factions called on the condemned to be pardoned, but Justinian ignored them, so they rioted. So half the city burns down, or at least the parts made of wood, and alas, the Hagia Sophia was built in 360 AD before stone was invented. Justinian then asks two up-and-coming mathematicians to build a new Hagia Sophia on the footprint of the old one, but this time made of stone. And lads, let your imagination run wild. No budget. Hey, what if we took a square-based church and built a spherical building? That'd be pretty neat. The Hagia is the earliest example we have of pendentive columns. The trouble with buildings made of stone is that they're very heavy and harder to stick together than wood. So if you wanted to rest a domed roof on a building, you really needed a circular base for it to sit on. Otherwise the weight isn't properly distributed. But the base of the buildings are usually square or rectangular. Typically, one would solve this problem by having a series of columns inside the building to support the domed roof. But that was not good enough for Isidorus and Anthemius. Here's what we do. Dig a square foundation with strong corner pillars and flat walls. But construct a hemisphere passing through each one of the four corners. If the walls are half as tall as they are long, then the intersection of this hemisphere and the square prism will be 4 semicircles. We then need to build 4 pillars in each corner that represent the interior portion of the hemispheres, so they are spherical triangular pillars that meet in a circular arches across each of the 4 walls. But the top of the square prism will be a flat plane that intersects this hemisphere in a circle. And this circle can then be the base of the circular dome for the roof, with all of the dome's weight evenly distributed along those triangular pillars and the walls. This then gives the impression of a floating dome, as the pillars are hidden in part of the walls. It appears to be held up by nothing but the majesty of whichever god is living there at the time. To add to this impression, the lower rim of the dome was ringed with an array of windows, so that on a sunny day there was a circular glare of light that dazzled and further gave the illusion of the dome being held up by God herself. It was the first of its kind, but then set the standard for all Byzantine churches going forwards. In fact, there's another church in Thessalonica also called Hagia Sophia. The other notable thing about the Hagia Sophia is the timescales involved. I'm working through a small single-storey extension at my own home, and so far the lengthiest aspect has been finding the builders who have the space on their schedules to come and build it. Quick shout out, if you're a building contractor working in the southwest of the UK and would like to sponsor this episode by building our extension, please comment below. It really helps the podcast. But Justinian was well aware of the lack of reliability of builders in this era and chose not to instruct a builder. He hired a pair of mathematicians. When a Roman emperor tells you that you and your friend are building the biggest and most ambitious church that has ever been constructed, you say how high. And when he says, I want it done in 5 years, you spit out your raki and say, quid dicis? For reference, the Colosseum in Rome, was built in 10 years, and that didn't even have a roof. If we're talking about churches, the Cologne Cathedral in Germany took 632 years to complete. I am surprised to note that the fastest proper cathedral I could find was the one that is just down the road from me in Salisbury, England, in 38 years in the 1200s. But the chief architects didn't work alone. They hired an astonishing 10,000 builders to achieve the feat. If you want to project power and stability in a city in the throes of sporting hooliganism, building a massive church in record-breaking time is a good way to do this. A bit like the Conservative government's attempts at the HS2 railway mega project. For international listeners unfamiliar with this particular political joke, you can translate it into your own country's reference frame by finding a skip full of trash and lighting it on fire. So, what made Isidorus and Anthemius so qualified? What was on their CVs? Certainly not architecture. Neither of them were trained architects. Anthemius, as we discussed last week, the master of conic sections and reflections. Isidorus, he was the bridge guy. Isidorus was one of the foremost scientific and mathematical minds of his time that Justinian had access to. He taught stereometry, which is like geometry specifically for 3D applications. He also taught physics, which is like mathematics for people who don't really mind if what they're doing is true. He taught at the universities of Alexandria and Constantinople, which is a bit of a lie because the phrase university doesn't mean the same thing as it does today. There was definitely a selection of schools in Alexandria, and my research suggests that there's a link between the school headed by Hypatia and the one taught by Isidorus several hundred years later. Recently, so 1960s-ish, archaeologists discovered a complex of 20 lecture halls, each of which could sit 20 to 30 students. But this is just as likely to be a private school of self-organised scholars as it is a government-sponsored university. Hey, Ben, slow down. What's the difference between a university and a school in ancient times? Well, that's a great question. It's primarily about the focus, funding, and scope. A school is generally privately funded, centred around a single master, focused on education for a fee in a small discipline set. Whereas a university would be a collection of scholars funded by a state or patron, focused on research with centralised resources and several disciplines working in the same area. So, was the centre at Constantinople a university? At the time of Isidorus, it was called the Pandidactitorum, which is as the name suggests, pan meaning several, and didact is teach through speech. Teaching at the centre were 31 chairs, or teachers, of various different subjects: Greek, Latin, philosophy, law, and rhetoric. It had most of the features that one might expect from a university: a broad faculty, substantial shared resources and facilities, government sponsorship. Although it did not award degrees or doctorates in the way that we might expect a university to nowadays. We have to wait for 1088 for a proper university in Bologna, which I'm sure we'll talk about in due course. You can, by the way, still apply for a degree course here, and if they ever decide to sponsor this episode, I'd be happy to include a link in the show notes. As I say, Isidorus was a well-known scholar and teacher at 2 prestigious centres of learning. His primary teaching material was Archimedes. He was the leading scholar of his work. Isidorus had completed a revised and checked exegesis of Archimedes, as well as a commentary on vaulting by Hero of Alexandria. There is some evidence, primarily in the work of his students, that Isidorus could be credited with starting his own school, although he wrote down very little original work. He is described by his peers as preferring to teach the material until he fully understood it himself, and by the time he fully understood the concepts, felt little need to write it down. Sadly, I can't tell you much about On Vaulting by Hero of Alexandria, because neither the Hero version nor the Isidorus commentary survive. It's only referenced by his pupil Eutocius, who we will discuss next week. Perhaps I will leave you with the thought experiment for yourself. If you have to bridge a gap between two very stable platforms, perhaps crossing a river, imagining that you can only use stone blocks and you are not allowed to put down any columns for support, what shape would you choose? A straight line would fall down immediately under its own weight, as there would be nothing to support the stones. Some kind of arch is required. But how would you choose the balance between additional path length and thus additional stone requirements and thus additional weight with the need for curvature to spread the weight to the end columns? Would a circular arc be better than a parabolic arc? Or possibly an ellipse? Or a catenary? Or an involute? Or many, many, many other curves that are ever so slightly different? I'm not here to give you any answers, either historical or correct, but perhaps I could ask you the question in such a way that makes you want to go and research it for yourself. I will give you a clue, though. Imagine a rope is hanging between two posts. The forces of tension and weight are perfectly balanced in the curve. So, if you invert that curve, would the forces of compression and weight also be perfectly balanced? But you didn't come here for me to tell you about the texts that didn't survive. You want the stories of the texts that only barely survived. So let's talk about Archimedes. Around 800 years before Isidorus was born, Archimedes invented a whole philosophy of mathematics, one he called the method. We discussed this in episode 24, but it essentially says use analogy to predict an outcome, then prove it rigorously later. This, along with much of Archimedes' work, was lost to history. We know of it through references, but nothing terribly concrete. A lot of Archimedes did survive. He wrote a lot of things down, but this most pivotal work was lost. Isidorus, however, did have access to it, as well as a lot of Archimedes' work. Remember that the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire was basically a continuation of the Greek heyday, so Isidorus wrote commentaries and study guides on Archimedes. This is not such an interesting fact until you follow what happened to one particular copy. 500 years later, an anonymous author preserved this copy and recopied it onto parchment. So this is now the third-hand version of what Archimedes 1300 years after the original draft. But almost as good as you can expect from texts of this age. This copy finds its way to Jerusalem, and we are now in the 10th century, so this is just at the tail end of the Abbasid Caliphate and about the start of the Fatimid Caliphate. We should note here that, generally speaking, Christians and Jews were protected under Islamic rule and allowed to continue their own worship and study in Jerusalem, apart from a small handful of rulers who ruthlessly persecuted them, but the Archimedean script was safe from religious oversight. That is, until 300 years later, a Christian monk who wanted to write a prayer book, because God enjoys hearing the exact same prayer repeated endlessly, rather than people speaking from the heart. Citation needed. Moreover, he didn't have any fresh parchment. I guess there was a shortage of goats at the time. So he went to the library, picked a book off the shelf, and made a palimpsest. This is where you scrape the parchment to remove the ink and reveal clean, fresh parchment below. So Johannes Myronas, yes, Johannes, if you're listening to this, this is what you ended up being famous for. Johannes Myronas defaced, literally, the parchment. He took the Archimedes Codex, scraped the original Greek text from the pages, cut the parchment along the centerfold, and rotated the leaves 90 degrees and folded them in half, and wrote down a book of prayers. Then nothing for nearly 700 years. In 1906, Danish philologist Johan Ludvig Heiberg, yes, another Johan, discovered the palimpsest in Constantinople. He was not specifically looking for anything other than interesting prayer books, but he knew enough Greek to recognise the text remnants behind the religious scripts. And no self-respecting philologist would see some hidden philology without wanting to explore it further. But the discovery was outstanding. I can only imagine the excitement growing as he started to recognise what he was reading. Brief glimpses here, the odd word there, a reference to the method, a phrase of the Stomachion, then the realisation that this was the unmistakable language and work of one of the greatest mathematical minds to have ever lived. It's like peeling back the wallpaper of an old stately home to find a mural painted on the plaster by Da Vinci. But then the story goes silent, again for another 90 years. The palimpsest passed between family across Europe, surviving 2 world wars, neglected, mouldy, corroded, falling apart. It turns up at Christie's, the famous auction house, in October 28, 1998. Someone had even painted over the text with a faux medieval painting to try and increase its value. And yet, the invaluable can always find its market value at an auction. So, for $2 million, which is approximately $4 million in today's money, it was purchased by an anonymous collector. We don't know who, but the rumour is that it was Jeff Bezos. I don't know if you're listening, Jeff, but on behalf of the Mathematicians podcast, thank you. And if you want to sponsor the show for a few mil per episode, just let me know on Blue Sky at mathematicians-pod. So this anonymous person, let's just call them JB, deposits the book with the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, USA. You can still go and see it there. Many initially believed that nothing more could be recovered from the book, given its dreadful condition. A spine covered in modern synthetic glue. Ugh. Yet, an international team of over 80 scientists and scholars embarked on an extraordinary mission. The first step was stabilisation. This took an astonishing 12 years, with 4 years alone dedicated to carefully disassembling the book. They meticulously documented every tiny piece, from paint chips to parchment fragments, stabilising flaking ink and making innumerable repairs with Japanese paper. Beginning in 2000, the team employed cutting-edge imaging techniques. They use multispectral imaging processing, different wavelengths of infrared, visible and ultraviolet light to make the erased text visible. By 2004, 80% of the manuscript had been imaged. For the most difficult pages, covered in grime or 20th century forgeries, they turned to the Stanford Synchrotron Radiation Light Source, SSRL. Here, a powerful X-ray beam scanned the leaves, detecting iron atoms in the original ink and mapping the writing, revealing vast sections of previously hidden text. The project yielded astonishing discoveries, confirming Archimedes' profound understanding of infinity and combinatorics. Beyond Archimedes, other lost works came to light. 20 pages from a manuscript of speeches by Hyperides, an Athenian orator, and 28 pages from a previously unknown commentary on Aristotle's categories. This is possibly my favourite ever story of historical archaeology, far more interesting than digging in the sand with a toothbrush. We've discussed the method before, back on episode 24 on Archimedes, but let me just check my notes. Somehow I neglected to mention the Stomachion. The Stomachion, meaning something like bone throwing, is a collection of fragments of a square that can be rearranged into many different shapes, a bit like the classic game of tangrams. The thought was this was a toy for children to make shapes, perhaps taking it in turns to construct something creative. But the rediscovery in the Archimedes palimpsest revealed its true brilliance. Within its hidden text, Archimedes described the real challenge of the Stomachion. How many ways can these 14 fixed pieces be reassembled to form a perfect square? He transformed what seemed a trivial pursuit into a profound exercise in combinatorics, a branch of mathematics dealing with counting, arrangement, and permutation. Later mathematicians managed to show that there were 17,152 distinct arrangements of the square, discovered by Fan Chung, Percy Diaconis, Susan P. Holmes, and Ronald Graham, and confirmed by a computer search by William H. Cutler. Not that it's terribly relevant, but I always like to look up the people I mention who might still be alive to see if I can tell them about the show. And I discovered that the four mathematicians who discovered the arrangements are a pair of husbands and wives, which is very cute. But go and find the Stomachion online for yourself. Print one out, cut it up, have some fun. So there we have it. Isidorus of Miletus. Cool guy. Built a big church and possibly founded a new school. Can't tell you much about him, but he does have 2 really interesting stories that link him into the history of mathematics, and that somehow makes it to 3,500 words. Next week, We go from teacher to student as we skip a generation ahead and meet our first mathematician from what would at the time have been called Palestine, and a town that is now about 10 kilometres from what is now at the time of writing called Gaza. It's what might be my first international diplomatic incident of the podcast, but hey, I write these a few weeks in advance, so who knows what's going to happen when this comes out. Next week is Eutocius of Ascalon. But if you can't wait until next time, then please go and follow me on Blue Sky at mathematicians-pod to find out more about what I'm doing. Very soon I will have another episode of my maths chat show, Unnatural Numbers, or you can get in touch with me if you want to guest write a future episode of the podcast. I'd love to hear from you. Until then, goodbye. The music today is Dance Macabre Finale by Kevin MacLeod. You can find more information in the show notes.